welcome everyone. I'm Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History, and I would like to welcome all of you to the Fall 2023 Draper Workshop. And of course, I would like to thank our distinguished guests who have traveled all the way to Stores to share their exciting scholarship with us. So I'm wearing two hats here as the sponsor of the Draper Workshop and also as a participant today. Our moderator, Professor Nancy Shoemaker from the History Department at the University of Connecticut, will introduce them shortly. Now, this Draper Workshop is a special one, as it is our first one after the pandemic. And I think it is particularly fitting that Nancy Shoemaker is our moderator today. You know, when I came to UConn a few years ago, I planned to start a Draper lecture series. But Nancy told me we already have the History Fusco lectures, we have a lecture series in Gender and History, the Foreign Policy Seminar. It would be different, she suggested, to have an informal workshop on different topics where we could invite leading scholars from across the country to present their work that might lead to generative conversations among students, faculty, and the broader public. So I'm really glad I took her advice. We've had tremendous success with this format. Each semester we convene workshops on different topics, like the history of human rights, or legal history, or the debate over monuments and commemoration, and as we are doing today, exploring the connections between Native American and African American history. So, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Nancy Shoemaker. She's of course well known as a pioneering figure in the field of Native American history. As I found out, there's scarcely a topic in Native American indigenous studies that Nancy has not weighed in on and written about. I'm actually rather envious of her productivity. Let me just read you the titles of her many field-defining books. American Indian Population Recovery in the 20th Century, published in 1999. A Strange Likeness, Becoming Red and White in 18th Century North America, published in 2004. Native American Whalemen and the World, Indigenous Encounters and the Contingency of Race, published in 2015. Pursuing Respect in the Hither Isles, published in 2019, which combines a transnational approach and indigenous studies to produce a much longer and richer historical genealogy of American empire. Even her edited collections have been heartbreaking. Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians, published in 2015. Clearing Apart, Theorizing the Past in Native American Studies, published in 2002. And Negotiators of Change, Historical Perspectives on Native American Women, published in 1995. Articles published in leading historical journals, American Historical Review, William Mary Quarterly, to name just a couple. Nancy's scholarly productivity over a storied career are matched only by her modesty. But before I hand over the floor to her, I want to thank everyone who made this workshop possible. First, Lincoln Hearn, the Draper Research Assistant and a graduate student in the History Department, who cheerfully negotiated a crash course in events planning. The invaluable History Department staff, Kira Sedgwick and Kathy Erickson, who make all things possible. And the work study undergraduate students who spent a lot of time posting posters all over the campus. And thanks also to my graduate students for helping with the reception today. Katie Angelica, Timothy Brown, and Alex Cuny. Thanks also to UConn Audiovisual Services and UC-SPAN for live streaming and recording this event for posterity on YouTube. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Nancy to introduce our participants today.
Well, this is very embarrassing. Manisha tricked me. She asked me to tell her how she should introduce me, and I said, I'll just introduce myself, planning to have something not so effusive. And it's really embarrassing because I'm not going to do the same for you guys. You're the stars of the show. So thanks a lot, Manisha, for this awkward situation. Anyhow, they are all stellar, amazing, prize-winning books, and so fortunate to have them here to share their thoughts on Native American and African American history, contradictions and convergences. I was going to mention some of their books because I believe at the reception there will be an opportunity to browse some of the books and perhaps sign copies of purchased books. Michael Wicken comes to us from Columbia University. He is the author of two hugely important books in my field: An Infinity of Nations, How the Native New World Shaped Early North America, and most recently, a very complex, fascinating book, Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America. Just came out a year or so ago, I believe. And Elena Roberts of the University of Pittsburgh. We haven't met before, but I was just telling her beforehand, I was watching her on a YouTube video talking about her book this afternoon to get ready for today. She has authored a book that is called I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. And I'm very interested to hear at some point about her current project, which is following the legacy of the history of slavery in the Five Nations, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek, and their relations with Black residents, anti-Black racism. You'll hopefully fill me in later. Linford Fisher is at Brown University and has been here many years now. I've seen him in action at Brown, giving talks and so forth. His first book was The Indian Great Awakening, Religion and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America. He has other books and many articles, and is currently working on a project on Native slavery in the English Caribbean and the United States that appears to have, he's also involved in his companion database on a related topic called, where he is the lead investigator, Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas. My colleague, Manisha Sinha, who betrayed me, is the Draper Chair in American History here at the University of Connecticut. She is almost the author of 3 books. She has her first book, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina. And most recently, this, what I would consider the most thorough, substantial book on the history of abolition, The Slave's Cause. She has recently just completed in manuscript, or it's in press, I believe, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. So each of our speakers is going to talk for about 10 minutes. At that point, I might ask if you want to respond to anything someone else said, and then we'll open it up for questions. And we have until 6 when there is this reception afterwards where you could talk to the speakers in person directly. So, Michael, we are going to go in the order of the poster. So, Michael, you're going to start for us.
Okay.
Do you want to come up to the podium?
Sure. Okay, so I'm mic'd up, so I don't need this. I'll save this for the impending rap battle afterwards. Okay, so the intersection of African American and Native history for me in this book that I just finished seeing read was something I kind of discovered as doing research. Part of the book was looking at a murder trial. There was an Ojibwe named Chigawaka Singh who Ojibwe from the sort of what would now be the headwaters of the Mississippi, upper northern Minnesota, murdered a man named Alfred Aiken, who was a mixed race Ojibwe. And Alfred Aiken's father was a fur trader, and upon his murder, his father wanted revenge, wanted to kill his murderer, had rounded up an extensive group of relatives, Indian and mixed race people, but were stopped from sort of following up with seeking this kind of private revenge by a missionary who was convincing that the murder happened in 1837 in the newly created Wisconsin Territory. And then the missionary said, "You're now part of the United States, we've got to follow the rule of law, we've got to go to court, got to take this to court." And so reluctantly, Alfred Aiken agreed to this. They captured Chigowaksing, brought him to trial, sent him down to Prairie du Chien, kind of now be Green Bay, where the sort of seat of government was, put him on trial, and the jury promptly threw him out, threw Chigowaksing out and said, "Well, this is an Indian who murdered another Indian. Neither of whom are citizens of the United States, therefore they can't be brought to trial." And this, in a sense, Alfred Aiken's father, William Aiken, who part of the bargain a lot of the fur traders are making in this territorial period is that their mixed race children, their indigenous wives are enumerated and counted as white, and they have all the privileges of white citizenship as a sort of way of helping facilitate the treaty process that's integral to developing places like Michigan, Wisconsin, into territories and into states. And so this was a sort of violation of this kind of agreement, and the reasoning of the jury, most of whom were not long-term residents or people involved in the fur trade, but more recent arrivals from New England, was that they saw two Indians, and they thought that the mixed race son, they literally used the term that was the condition of the child follows the condition of the mother, something linked to thinking about race and slavery. And the father was incensed about this, so I was researching this trial, and I was kind of curious to find out if I could find other instances where mixed race people who are negotiating the boundaries between citizenship or not, Native people, as you may or may not know, don't have citizenship in the United States until 1924. And this lasts into the 20th century. So my grandmother, for example, was born on the Red Cliff Ojibwe Reservation in 1920, was born not a citizen of the United States, even though my family had been here for millennia. And so people are negotiating whether or not the mixed race people in this early territorial period can claim rights of citizenship. They have been, as I said, because they're cooperating with sort of American officials. So I started looking at other murder trials, and I was finding it kind of all over the map. Another murder trial in the same year happened in Mackinac, which is northern Michigan, which relies heavily on the fur trade. And not only were they counting mixed race people as capable of voting, but the head of the jury of this murder trial I was looking at, which was one Indian murdering another Indian, the head of that jury trial was a mixed race person. So these are two Indians who are caught up in a murder, their case is being adjourned. So I was thinking about looking for more cases, and I stumbled into not murder trials, but voting rights cases, where mixed race people, how were their citizenship holding up? And I found a number of voting rights cases in Ohio in the same time period. And the voting rights cases were pretty fraught. And mixed race person votes, the person contends, and in this time period, most of the mixed race people are in what would have been the Northwest Territories are Democrat, because the Democrats are people in charge of patronage, and that's who gives you Indian agent jobs and post jobs, so like that. And they're also usually involved in the fur trade. And so you have Republicans contesting with mixed race people who are voting Democrats, and it goes to court, and ultimately the Ohio Supreme Court says, yes, we can allow this. In fact, this territory has always had mixed race people exercising citizenship privileges. The dissent was what kind of got my attention. And the dissent, in this case, in several other cases of mixed race votes, the dissent was adamant about this, that we can't give privileges to mixed race indigenous people, not because we care. They've been involved in Northwest Territory civil society from the time it was passed into American governance, but rather we can't give those privileges to mixed race people, because if we do, we would have to give the same sort of privileges to free black citizens in this territory. And the concern there that they're articulating is that if we do that, we have to grant privileges to free black persons, and they have the right to vote. That means they would be able to integrate the schools and send the children to schools. And so the pushback against giving Native people's rights wasn't anti-indigenous racism, it was anti-black racism. That was at the core for the pushback against the giving other rights to other people of color. And this was true in case after case after case that I was finding, that they were usually being adjudicated in favor of allowing mixed race people to vote, but in every instance, the dissent was citing the fear of this prospect of having to admit free black people into similar sorts of privileges, and they were citing the state constitution, and they were in, the dissent was beside themselves because they were saying, look at the Constitution. So I started looking at the state constitution, and the Northwest Territories, as you may or may not know, are well, would now be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And part of the deal is that they all have to have, the Northwest Ordinance in place, they all have to have fugitive slave clause, and they all have to be free states. And they were needed to sort of match the rapidly expanding slave South, where Mississippi and Alabama in Arkansas are all being created as new states. You need corresponding free states. So they're all nominally free states with fugitive slave laws built into their constitution. And what happened was the state constitution that the jurors were citing in this appeal were that in each case, as Ohio formed a territory, then Indiana, then Illinois, then Michigan, all one after another, they all amended their state constitutions for the Northwest Ordinance as free white people, 5,000 free white settlers, you can form a territory. 60,000 free white inhabitants, you can enter the Union as a state. And every one of those states changed their constitution not to be free, it's free inhabitants, 55,000 and 60,000. Every one of the states changed their constitution to not be free inhabitants, but free white. So they pegged the privilege of the franchise and citizenship to whiteness. They also, every single state in the Northwest Territories then, after doing this and finding it wasn't impeding free black immigration, every single state in the Northwest Territories also passed a series of black laws, so that if you move to Ohio Territory, for example, or Michigan Territory, as a free black citizen, you have to have proof of your freedom. You have to take that proof of freedom to the Justice of the Peace in the county that you live in, and you have to post a $1,000 bail to secure your status there. Now, $1,000 in 1837 is a lot of money, and it's designed to try and prohibit free black immigration. They also posted a series, every single state, again, each state that becomes Northwest Territory, post other black laws that say if you hire somebody without checking that they've paid the status and credit bond, we're going to fine you and penalize you. And so essentially what you end up with is a commitment to sort of, in a jurisdictional or a juridical kind of sense, the argument is that you're linking African-American descended people with indigenous people as people being outside of civil society, as people who haven't sort of entered the state of the union and cannot. And the argument was that they are in fact like Indian people, that is, they should be non-citizens. And of course, citizenship is something that is available for lots of free black people, although they have to negotiate it. They don't all necessarily exercise the same bundle of freedoms to go with it, right to vote, right to testify in a trial, things like that. It varies from place to place, but I was learning how much the kind of colonial project that America is engaging in the Northwest Territories is very much linked to the sort of parallel notions of dispossessing indigenous people, but also monetizing black bodies and black labor, and excluding it where it wasn't absolutely necessary for the colonial project. So where it is necessary for the colonial project, in the slave South, you're growing cotton and you need a labor regime that you can't get free labor to do, then black slaves are the remedy. In the North, where they don't have the same sort of free labor project, you can exclude blacks, and to the extent that they are there, you can sort of over-police them and extract money from them in the same sort of sense. And in this sense, it was kind of very much linked to the kind of overall plunder economy, of taking money from these populations in the Northwest Territory, because as Michigan and Ohio was being formed, coming up to the end of my time, so I'll do this real quick. Each of these states, unlike the original 13 states, are formed entirely out of the treaty process. So a state like Michigan or Ohio is formed through a series of treaties, one after another, that extinguishes, that are usually coerced, where the indigenous people are forced to give up their title to, say, 13 million acres for 1836 treaty in Washington, one of 11 treaties that constitute the state, staying on a small reservation but transferring the rest of that land to public domain. And so you've got both the treaty process where you're dispossessing people, taking their main asset from them, but then that comes ostensibly with an annuity, an annual payment to compensate you for that loss, usually for 20 years, something in the neighborhood of $20,000. In the case of every single one of these treaties, when it was time to pay the annuity, approximately 90–95% of that annuity would be claimed by various merchants and state officials as debt that Indian people held. So that you're not only dispossessing Indian people, with the treaty process that's facilitating dispossession is a way in which you're getting cash on an annual basis for 10, 20-year period by claiming that Indian people in your jurisdiction owe you a debt of money for trade because they hadn't paid off. And this was really important because in the 19th century, currency is rare, and so cash payments are ways in which the Northwest Ordinance, the people who are merchants and state officials, are sort of capitalizing the development of their state, not just in taking Indian land and dispossessing, but in claiming the money that's going to those indigenous peoples in order to kind of finance their business, develop the state. And this extension of policing black people in the same sense was very much the same sort of process. It's part of the same sort of plunder economy, where you're taking people you're not fully granting their status as full humanity, and you're sort of finding out ways to make money off them in order to facilitate the development of the state and the sort of transition from an indigenous space into a colonized space that enters the Union. And so I very much kind of learned that these two things were inseparable. The sort of history with regard to African descended people, black labor and slave labor, as well as the sort of movement for free soil and the sort of free soil movement that's anti-slavery that gives rise to free soil movement in the Northwest Territories. So totally interconnected and part of the same colonial project, and I think I'm at the end of my 10 minutes, so I'm
Is it on now? Yes. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Manisha, for having me in such a distinguished series. Having just become a new associate professor, it feels weird, really, to be among such people and such people historically, so thank you. And thank you all for being here. So my work is a reflection of my journey to understand my own family history. Something that was kind of right there in front of me the entire time and didn't hit me until I was in college, like many of you are. Like most people who identify themselves as African American, I come from people who were enslaved for generations. But on my father's side, my ancestors weren't owned by white people. They were owned by Native Americans. And so in the 1830s, they, along with their Chickasaw and Choctaw Indian owners, embarked on a journey that you probably know as the Trail of Tears. They made their way to what is now Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. During the Civil War, their owners fought for the Confederacy. And when the Confederacy lost, the United States government forced my family's owners, along with all other Native American slave owners, to free their slaves and provide them with land. And so that reframing of how people think of slavery, Indian removal, the Civil War, Reconstruction, is the core of my book. I've been here all the while. And so when I began graduate school at Indiana University, there was only one book in existence on the topic of people like my family. So there were many things that I could certainly glean and extrapolate from the work of other fabulous scholars who came before me, who did work on the Cherokees and the Creeks. So people like Ty Miles, Celia Naylor, Claudio Sant, Fay Yarbrough. But that relationship between those Native people and those enslaved black people was different. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws had a different history. They were the most adamant to instate antebellum laws that governed the lives of their slaves, restricting their mobility, their opportunities to learn to read and write, their ability to gather together. When they made the decision to fight the Civil War, they were the Indian nations most united in their alliance with the Confederacy. And after the Civil War, they were the only of the 5 slaveholding tribes, the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, and themselves, not to provide citizenship for their former slaves. And so that would be like the US government deciding not to grant citizenship to African Americans after the Civil War. And that definitely was a possibility, but in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations, that did indeed happen. And that is still a legacy, as kind of was hinted at in my introduction, that I'm trying to follow in my next book, how that kind of plays out today. But let me back up and give you a little context if you don't know what I'm talking about. So the Chickasaws and the Choctaws, as well as members of 3 other Indian nations, began catching, buying, and selling black people as slaves in the mid-1700s. Together, these 5 tribes are known as the 5 tribes, but historically, they're actually known as the 5 civilized tribes. And this is civilized in quotations, of course, because when the US government, right after its birth as a nation, began encouraging Native people to adopt aspects of Euro-American culture, including language, clothing, gender norms, religion, and political structures, these nations had members who were very interested. And slavery was, of course, part of Euro-American culture. And so as the number of the wealthiest, most influential members of those tribes began to shift into new native identities that encompassed new ways of living and thinking, learning English, educating themselves in American institutions, creating their own newspapers, and remodeling their governments to look like that of the United States. So even today, they still have executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They also accepted, to various degrees, a new racial hierarchy that justified African enslavement. But, unfortunately for them, these changes did not prevent them from being driven out of their homelands and forced to live in the West on this journey that I've mentioned, the Trail of Tears. And so I would like you to think of the Trail of Tears as a movement of Native as well as Black people, because enslaved people, like my family members, are also on that journey. And during that trial, leaving their homeland as well, and then their arrival in Indian Territory is the beginning of the other part of my book's focus. And so I began by excavating these stories about what it was like for Black people to live in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations. But as I wrote the book, I increasingly thought about how we think and talk about place in Native American history and studies. Place is so significant in our field because we're often chronicling how Native people have strong ties to land they claim as their own. Ties that are connected to oral traditions, the local herbs they use, their relationships with ecosystems, and so on. But the reality is that most Native people have moved at some point in history, seeking better resources, escape from violence, or to fight and conquer another people and take their land. And so it's not always as easy as simply calling a people indigenous to a certain space, because many spaces have layered and conflicting claims. And for the 5 tribes in particular, when they were forced to move to Indian Territory, they weren't just moving to another place. They were bringing with them some of the might of the United States government, as well as these Euro-American cultural norms that I've mentioned, some of them adopted. And so they used those norms and the relationship that they'd cultivated with the US government through their adoption of those norms to, I argue, rewrite the history of Indian Territory. And so Indian Territory, Oklahoma, was not this kind of empty space like I at least was taught in elementary school. There were already Native people living there. People who we would consider Western Indians, so people like the Caddos, the Comanches, the Wichita, the Apaches, some Osage, who you might know from Killers of the Flower Moon. But those people weren't considered civilized like these 5 slaveholding tribes. And so when they expressed their anger at having their land taken, they were ignored. And when they raided or murdered out of anger, they were portrayed as the aggressors, not the 5 tribes who were moving on to their land. And the 5 tribes called for military support from the US to support them in their new homes. They also created a narrative that they had settled Indian Territory, using words and ideas created by white people like wilderness to describe what it was supposedly like before they had arrived. And so because as civilized people, they were the ones building schools and churches and government buildings and plantations, because the Western Indians already there hadn't done that. And so in their minds, that meant they might as well not even have been there. And so when I talk about how slavery changed the way the 5 tribes thought about Black people, it was also part of the change in the way the 5 tribes thought about other Native people who had not adopted these same American customs. And so not only did the 5 tribes now think that they were better than Black people, they also thought that they were better than many other Native people. And you can see it in the writings that a lot of their leaders have in archives and institutions. And so by the 1850s, the 5 tribes are thriving in their new homeland. They have rebuilt successfully. But in the United States, of course, discord over the institution of slavery is brewing. Abolitionists are gaining a foothold in popular culture. Various states are voting on allowing it within their borders. And as southern states secede, the Confederacy approaches these 5 tribes, knowing that it has multiple things in common with them. They're both from the South, although these are states that have, of course, pushed these Native people out, but they also own slaves. They have kind of a similar culture, and they also make various promises to them. And so after moving out of the Southeast, the United States government does pay these tribes for their land, pennies on the dollar, but it pays them. And it's still actually quite slow in usually giving this yearly. And so the Confederacy is aware of this because the Confederacy is comprised of people who have served as Indian agents, mediators, lawyers for the 5 tribes. And so it kind of plays on these things that it knows the United States government is not doing to the 5 tribes' satisfaction. It also offers them congressional representation, something that the Cherokees have been fighting for hundreds of years, really. and still have just launched actually kind of a reinvigorated push for that. They also promise that they will treat them better, be more honest with them, etc. And these are enticing to the 5 tribes, but also they're in the midst of Confederate territory. And so it kind of makes practical sense for them to think about making an alliance with the Confederacy. And that's what happens. But they all split, really. So some Native people fight for the Confederacy, some people fight for the United States, some are neutral, some leave. And when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that some tribal members did stay loyal, did fight for the United States, and uses treaties after the war to punish them. So there are, if you didn't know, actually civil war battles in what is now Oklahoma. There are civil war battles in the West. In Indian Territory, there are 14 battles specifically, and those destroy much of the Cherokee and Creek nations. And so they need the money that they're supposed to be getting from the United States for the sales of their land to rebuild. And the US uses that. They say, we're not gonna give you that money that we know you desperately need, that we already owe you, unless you sign new treaties. And so treaties are how the war ends in Indian Territory. And treaties are also how my family is emancipated. So not the Emancipation Proclamation, not the 13th Amendment. It is a treaty that ends the Civil War, forces Native people to give up even more land, the land they've just moved on to about 30 years earlier. Also forces them to free their slaves, to give those rights, all the same rights as citizens, and also to give them land. And so this is all in 1866. So this is before we have the 14th Amendment in the United States. It's before we have the 15th Amendment in the United States. And so in all of these nations, except mine, the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations, former slaves can vote. They can serve on juries. And they're mostly safe from the sort of white violence that is becoming normal in the South after the Civil War. And so what I argue in my book is that this is a different Reconstruction project, one that is running parallel, and that is, I argue, more successful, because it does end with people, to an extent, becoming economically successful and or at least autonomous. So they can rely on their own farms. Some of them have oil. And some of this land becomes the foundation of places like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So if you've read about the Tulsa Massacre, those African Americans come to Oklahoma because they see that there are already Black people there, and those Black people have land. And so when people are thinking after the Civil War about, where can we go? How can we escape this white violence? Oklahoma, or what will become Oklahoma, looks very attractive because they already see people there who are enjoying what they hope to one day create. And so they come here. Oklahoma then has over 20 Black towns, which is the space in the United States with the most historical Black towns. And it really kind of creates a space where people hope might become a racial paradise. And my book ends with the Tulsa Massacre because unfortunately it shows that that is not to be. There is no place in the United States that Black people can go to escape prejudice, no matter what they do. And I'm trying not to end on a depressing note there, but in my next book, I hope to kind of explore what happens after that. How does land structure the lives that people have, Black, Native, and white in Indian Territory, moving up into discussions about citizenship and who is Native, Afro-Indigenous identity, etc. But I'm sure we'll get into that in the questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? A little bit? All right. Thanks for being here. Thank you so much for this invitation, and it's really a delight to share this stage, or the chairs here at least, with such a distinguished group of historians and scholars. It's really wonderful. So I am going to be talking with you, talking at you, thinking through with you about the complexities of Native American and African American history through 2 different projects that I am working on, which I think Nancy has already mentioned both of them. The first is a large-scale history of indigenous enslavement in English-speaking spaces in the Atlantic and North America, and then eventually after 1776, the United States, really from the 16th century through the late 19th century and even beyond. The second is a tribally collaborative project called Stolen Relations, recovering stories of indigenous enslavement in the Americas. that is roughly the same time frame as 1492 to 1880, 1900 even, and beyond. And we're trying to, in collaboration with some regional tribal nations and representatives, to carefully catalog and centralize information regarding and that presents to the public information about enslaved and unfree indigenous people at the time. Just a shameless plug here, you can find us on Twitter, or X, whatever. At Stolen Relations is the handle, and also online at stolenrelations.org. So we've been working on this since 2015, it'll go live next year, thanks to a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. But it really is, it's meaningful and important that we're working with regional tribal representatives to think through these questions, to do some decolonizing work, and present it in a way that doesn't just replicate the harms of the archive and the kind of language that's being used. So I'm going to ask a few questions, I think, maybe as a way to sort of prompt things. I don't have tons and tons of comment, no slides or anything, but just wanted to get us thinking together about how these histories intersect through the questions surrounding indigenous enslavement. So two of the biggest questions we're trying to explore in both projects, really. First is how might understanding the long history of indigenous enslavement help us understand both the nature of settler colonialism as well as give us a fuller history of slavery in the US. So how can indigenous enslavement help us understand settler colonialism differently or better, and also understand the fuller expanse of slavery in the US? Secondly is who counts as indigenous, and why does that matter? And I think this has already been reflected in some ways in the comments so far. So let me say a bit about each one. First, about understanding the nature of settler colonialism and a fuller history of slavery. I want to just say up front that the point here with both of these projects and the work we're doing in Stolen Relations is never and not at all to try to displace or replace or move to the side the incredibly important history of the transatlantic slave trade and African slavery in the United States and the hemisphere as a whole. There doesn't have to be some sort of competition here. This is just a part of that history, right? But the question here is, can indigenous slavery help us expand our sense of slavery's long reach in the Americas? So once you look at this history of the hemisphere through indigenous enslavement, then you really have to start at 1492 with Columbus, who's the first enslaved. The very first trip takes back at least up to 30 indigenous people who are enslaved, and proposes a whole enterprise based upon enslaving people in the Americas and shipping them back to Europe, right? But then the English colonies, there's multiple possible starting points that are before 1619. So English traders and adventurers and explorers kidnapping indigenous people off the coastlines of North America, the Caribbean, even South America at times, taking them back to Europe, and in some cases selling them into slavery all before 1619. So how does that reshape our understanding of what it means to think about the origins of slavery in what now is the United States? The second question is, can indigenous slavery help us further understand the murkiness of slavery as it emerges over time, and the complicated legal context in which slavery is hammered out over time, by highlighting things like debt slavery, judicial enslavement, peonage, and term enslavement, all of which you can find in sort of African American context, but really come before indigenous enslavement context as well. And the third question here is, can indigenous slavery help us understand slavery as connected to dispossession in a way that looking only at African American enslavement doesn't quite so much? You probably heard the phrase, the two original sins of the United States are what? Enslaving Africans and dispossessing Native Americans. So what happens when Native Americans are both enslaved and dispossessed? How does that change our own sense of this history? To enslave people and then take their land that they were just on is something slightly different than importing people across the ocean. I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's just different, and we should acknowledge that in a way. Here we are at the University of Connecticut, not to put too fine a point on it, a place in your own lit acknowledgement that acknowledges a number of different indigenous nations, as well as the Pequot Nation, who in 1636, 1637, genocidal war was waged against them. They were sold into slavery in Boston, shipped overseas, and immediately after that war, what happens? All these towns on the Connecticut coast are founded suddenly. Why? Because warfare, enslavement leads to dispossession and opening up of space, which I think is really important. Actually, the second question then is who counts as indigenous and why does this matter? And here I'm primarily referring to people with multiple racial identities and family backgrounds, and so this ties in a bit to Michael and Elena's comments for sure. So it's a little more obvious in the 16th and early 17th century in terms of identifying people as indigenous or Indian in the archives. It gets a little less clear over time, and this is where I think the rub is. When you have intermarriage with either white or African-American people, African people over time, this sort of mixed race population emerges, and certain verbiages around their identity emerge over time too. And so the core of this question is a critique of colonial and 19th century racial logics and definitions that tended to blacken mixed race people and therefore make them more enslavable and submerge indigenous identities. So 19th century racial logic states that all it took was one quote unquote drop of black blood to taint, to make someone black. Whereas conversely, indigenous people had to be 100% indigenous to be seen as authentically quote unquote indigenous, right? So this racial logic is all over the archive in various terminologies used for multiple race people, but all of these cast doubt on indigenous identity from the early colonial period up through the end of the 19th century. And we, as scholars, I think, have often followed this in our scholarship over the decades. And I don't think that's too strong of a statement to say that, but we sort of unthinkingly follow that way. So why does this matter? First of all, I think that we, in following this, we allow the archive of 19th century racism to shape our understanding of people's own lived experiences and self-identities. Secondly, I think this has led to a significant undercounting and invisibilizing of indigenous people in American history, both enslaved and free. So whether it's in runaway or self-emancipated advertisements, when enslaved people ran away, who are both indigenous and black, but they're seen only as Negro or black in the advertisements. From plantation records, sort of erasing indigenous identity of people on plantations, bills of sale, probate records, official censuses. I can't tell you how many times I've come across colonial censuses that only tabulate black and white, but we know from probate records and the records that there are indigenous people and slaves there as well. Anyway, I could go on, but I think that there's a lot here to sort of think through. Another related issue, which I won't touch because Elena's book is really what you should read to learn more about this, is about freedmen after the Civil War and the question of indigenous identity and this situation of being tribally enrolled, but being seen in questionable ways by both whites and also indigenous populations too. So for stolen relations in particular, there's several opportunities and challenges I would just highlight here. So because of these sort of overlays of racial identity, we've tried to figure out how to sort of present that in a complex way in a digital environment, which is kind of challenging. And so what we're doing is we just basically, instead of choosing one racial identity, we are sort of layering them because that's how we think people understood them in the past and in the present maybe as well. And there's more I could say about this too. There's some obvious ways in which we can recognize indigenous identity, but there's other ways that aren't so obvious. Like what happens when you have people in the archive or self-emancipated slave ads who are listed as quote unquote Negro, but also they're described as having long black Indian hair, right? Like how do you tabulate that in a digital project? And how do we think about this historically? Or maybe who are listed as black but are rumored to be heading to Indian territories, or who are listed as black but it says that they walk like an Indian or talk like an Indian, right? All these sort of racialized ways of greeting people. So we've been pretty comprehensive or inclusive in the database. Freedom suits in the 18th and 19th century also raised the question about family histories and memory and how these identities are narrated, as well as the Works Progress Administration records, which I know were so important to Elena's work, from the 1930s, people who narrate indigenous ancestors. I think we should take them seriously. That's what the book and also the project is arguing. So I'll conclude just by saying I know these issues aren't unique to the two projects I'm working on. That's part of why this conversation is so great. We can move together and learn from each other, and I'm eager to learn more from you all and also from my co-panelists. Thank you so much.
So busy taking notes for these fabulous presentations that I have to order my papers here. So unlike our previous presenters who have really given us some really rich ideas in 10 minutes each, which is actually amazing, and really delve deeply into particular historical periods and topics. I'm going to do just sort of an overview as the last speaker of how we may think about these two fields of study, African American and Native American history. Is it possible to redefine the history of early America by paying consistent attention to the subjects and viewpoints covered by the explosion of scholarship in African American and Native American history? Critics of early American history have incorporated new theoretical and spatial approaches personified by the debate over settler colonialism and its interpretive usefulness, or the hashtag Vast Early America, that seeks to incorporate overlooked histories and spaces into our historical understanding of the United States. Now, recent debunking histories of the American Revolution have done a 180 degrees turn on the revolutionary nature of the American War of Independence that go well beyond the question of who should rule at home, as the critical scholarship of the progressive school put it. If anything, recent attempts to view the early American Republic as a, quote, post-colonial nation have only exposed the wide gulf between early America and the modern decolonizing nations of the global South, where the idea was first deployed. So as Michael Whitkin notes, quote, the United States has been a colonial power since its inception. Only by reckoning with the history of indigenous people and African Americans in all their facets and complexities, that is narrated so beautifully today, can the United States be genuinely thought of as a post-colonial country. A fundamental reorientation of American history requires different origin points, topics, and timelines, and not just mirror opposites of existing narratives and periods. What Phil Deloria has called the master narratives of US history. So I'm going to skip this because I'm going to keep to the 10 minutes too. Now, from the perspective of indigenous history, only recently have historians such as Michael Whitkin, Catherine Duval, Ned Blackhawk, Becca Hamalainen, and Elliot West written new syntheses that reimagines early American history as Native American history. Prior to them, much of the critical work done on early Native history employed the ideas of conquest and genocide to critique what we call settler colonialism today. But to view the history of early America as the history of Native America, one would also have to broaden our lens to include the indigenous history of pre-colonial America. Early America might very well be late Native America, to conduct just one thought experiment in the historiography of the Americas. It is not just that one cannot write a history of the United States without American Indians. One cannot write a history of early America without accounting for nations and histories that came before it. But the indigenous turn in early American history begs for such a reckoning in US history, similar to the manner in which Latin Americanists pay attention to the history of the Incas, Mayas, Aztecs, and other indigenous people. The emergence of Native American and indigenous studies as a field with distinct perspectives and methods leads the way for early American historians to interrogate the methodological and theoretical confines of their work. Much of the pushback against Native American and indigenous studies resembles earlier criticisms of African American studies, where innovative and new methodologies, which are often viewed as less objective or scholarly, and interdisciplinarity are seen as posing a challenge to the history as a field, and historical methods based on rigorous research in a large evidentiary base. In African American history, it was not so much, quote, the silence of the archives as the neglect of a vibrant Black print culture that allowed early Americanists, as I have recently argued, to erase or belittle the presence of African American men and women in the abolition movement and in local, state, and national politics. As Michel Trullo has shown in the case of the Haitian Revolution, such forgetting requires the active silencing of existing archival sources. Now, I was told not to use slave narratives and early Black literature in my book on abolition, as they did not apparently constitute, quote, historical evidence. This is decades after modern historians of slavery were forced to defend the use of slave testimony, even though planter diaries, letters, and pro-slavery literature had been used virtually uncritically. Beyond the rich archive of Afro-Americana, scholars like Marissa Fuentes and Saidia Hartman have developed ways in which to use slim records to reconstruct the lives of Black women and people who may not have directly left manuscript or published records. Hartman's notion of, quote, critical fabulation, faced her critics, is not the invention of narrative arguments sans evidence, but to explore the limits of what we can do with sparse and horrific sources. Similarly, criticism of Native American indigenous studies methods to include descendants and indigenous nations in the telling of their history must be met with a response that adding, not replacing, to the vast array of methods that historians can deploy gives us a multifaceted and responsible history, rather than sort of dismiss summarily. Future historians of pre-colonial Native American history might also want to borrow tools and methods developed by pre-colonial Africanists and African Americanists. The two fields are ripe for scholarly interchange and collaboration in ways that may permanently redefine what we understand as United States history. Now, not just in terms of method, but also in terms of innovative theoretical intervention, especially since United States history compared to histories of other regions remains notoriously empirical and averse to theory. African American and Native studies have led the way. The revived attention to slavery and capitalism has given rise to debates over, quote, racial capitalism in Black history, just as debates over settler colonialism has come to dominate discussions of genocidal warfare and dispossession of indigenous nations. Now, even in terms of subject matter, the two fields intersect across the span of US history, as we have just heard, whether in the persistence of Afro-Native populations in New England, as Lynn argued, a lot of times indigenous identity is submerged within an overarching racial Black identity, questions of enslavement, emancipation, and identity in the Southwest, as Elaine has argued, Indian peonage and servitude that persisted into the 19th century, and over wars of conquest and settler encroachments on native land. Even the idea of citizenship, I noticed in my recent work on Reconstruction, has to take into account that many of these Reconstruction amendments and laws excluded what they called Indians not taxed, meaning sovereign Indian nations. But as Phil Deloria argues, after the passage of the 1924 Citizenship Act for Native Americans, many Native Americans seized the idea of citizenship not as a colonizing discourse or even as an area of contestation, as Steve Kantrowitz has recently argued, but more as an assertion of what he calls collective political rights, in a way to sort of reinscribe their claims to land and sovereignty. Now, indeed, the long afterlives of slavery and imperialism in the United States requires an overdue reckoning of early America itself. Perhaps a full investigation of all the connections and contradictions between Native and African American history, what Tyre Miles calls, quote, the settler colonial slavery complex, might point the way for a truly post-colonial history of the United States with a broader temporal, spatial, and topical reach than the ways in which we define and study US history today. As Miles further advocates to, quote, refine our understanding of African American history, Western history, and Native history, but also to contribute surprising opportunities for identifying challenges to settler colonial forms that avoid simple binaries. The Afro-settler, she concludes, is an exo-settler, pushed by exigencies of exodus, of exile, and almost always exogenous to the settler state. And this is where her work actually really reminded me of reading Nancy Shoemaker's book, Native American Whalemen and the World, where she looks at Native American whalemen involved as a part of the expansion of the United States into the Pacific and Arctic, but bringing with them the history of violent dispossession of lands that they had lost and subjugation that ended up kind of sort of legitimizing American expansion elsewhere. So it's a far more complex and nuanced view of these whalemen rather than as simply as colonizers or simply as victims. Now, recent work by Vanessa Holden and Alejandra Dubkowski also reveal how histories of Black and Native resistance and accommodation are essentially incomplete without accounting for the women who shaped them as surely as their male counterparts. And here again, of course, I'm going to embarrass you more, Nancy. Her work is a bit of a trailblazer in this regard, where she looked at Native American women as negotiators of change, and concept that Tyre Miles has recently adopted in her work on African American history and women. Now, I'd like to just end with a suggestion that we may perhaps very well evoke the methods and theories of post-colonial histories from the rest of the world, especially subaltern studies, when reimagining US history in this manner. Within United States history, historians of imperialism and indigenous life have complicated exceptional nationalist narratives that call for reconceptualizing periodization, fixed identities, political economy, and state formation. Post-coloniality and hybridity might prove to be a more capacious, inclusive, complex, and perhaps a more accurate theoretical lens to understand a complex past that our notions of early America that have for force been constructed around nations of, or notions of national belonging and exclusion. So that is it for me, 10 minutes, and I'm going to hand it over.
So I don't know if any of you have thoughts or where you want to say something additional, or we open it up. Open it up. Okay. I may have to run around the room with this microphone. I didn't know that was going to be part of my job. Oh, we're going to make Lincoln run around the room with the microphone.
What are graduate students for?
Yeah. Well, he gave an excellent lecture in my class this morning, so he already works for me. Feels like normal. Anyone have comments or questions for any of the speakers or all of them? Martha.
Thank you. Really wonderful talks, and I'm so fascinated by the overlaps and convergences you guys are talking about. It's just great. I have this question for Linford Fisher because I know the least about your research. I'm an English professor and I work on African American literature, but also racial passing. So I was curious about the fact that I wrote an article where I talked about what different kinds of racial passing went on, and that individuals would pass for Native American. And I know you have a recent article that talks about the murkiness of that category. So I was just curious about the way Native American identity was used in Escape, or if you think those advertisements where they're saying this individual is gonna pass as Native American, and perhaps the individual was mixed race, I mean, is that really what's going on there? Or, because I think the conception in the minds of a lot of people during the 19th century was that Native Americans were not being enslaved. So the people who are escaping use that idea. So I'm just curious about whether you thought about the role of the category of Native American as free played into escapes of enslaved, I guess, Native Americans in this case.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's certainly something I wrestle with a lot, and I guess I feel like the field and our histories have erred on one side, maybe, and I maybe am erring on the other side to swing it back a little bit, and I'm hoping people argue with me, but not too much, because I think that that's what makes for a productive sort of, not a synthesis, but finding sort of another way to talk about it. I don't know that we can really know, and maybe that's part of the answer to your question. I fully believe that people leverage identities in different kinds of ways. As part of what makes that interesting is sort of the agency implied in that. But do I think that there was never any basis to those claims? I'm not so sure, and I think that the skepticism has been the ruling hermeneutic here to date, and I want to open up space to say, well, but what if there was something there? And that's the same is true with these freedom suits, right? Only a few of them get dismissed, because what they do is they start to sort of interview people, and they bring people across state lines, and they say, hey, you know Sarah? Like, yeah, I grew up with Sarah, and her mother was Cherokee or whatever, right? Like, so you like start paying off a lot of people to lie on your behalf in courts of law. But yeah, you do find some cases where judges are like, yeah, I don't believe that, or whatever else. So it's a fantastic question, and I wish I could answer it more fully, but my sort of leanings is to sort of start with the assumption there's something there and move forward.
Was there a pattern where the enslavement of Native Americans were most, I think you mentioned New England at some point, is that where the enslavement of Native Americans mostly occurred?
Yeah, so I'm going to sound stupid and say read the book when it comes out, but basically it's, I know, I'm just kidding. I think there is the assumption that it's an early phenomenon, and I think what I found and why the book now goes to 1880, 1890 is that I just kept on finding things. And so there's a continuity of different forms of enslavement and unfreedom right up to the American Civil War. I think there's indigenous people on southern plantations all over that we've missed. And then it takes a separate act by Congress in 1867 to outlaw peonage, which is functional enslavement in New Mexico and Arizona and California, much like the Northwest Territory, claims itself to be a free state, and there's up to 6,000 unfree indigenous people at the start of the Civil War. So it's an American thing, not just an English colonial, and it's not just a Spanish leftover. Americans make it their own, and so that's kind of the story I'm trying to tell. So, thanks.
Next. Well, I can do it. If no one else wants to, I'm not missing anyone, is that right?
Thank you all, this was great. I'm just wondering how in the big picture we add in indigenous North Americans' own traditions of capture and enslavement. So I mean that didn't quite come in. So it seems to me we can push the history back even farther than what you proposed, Linford, right? So we have some, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the amazing secondary lit on this, Andres Resendes, et cetera. You know? So, because especially in teaching about gender and captivity and enslavement, that's been helpful for me to introduce other settings in the Southwest and Texas and the raiding by Apaches and the Comanches and the, different kinds of enslavement too, which is something I think all of us have tried to do in our scholarship, in our teaching in the last few decades. So I'm wondering how that would enter your stories and Manisha's reflections on the historiography too.
think James Brooks.
There's Ty Miles was mentioned, her first book in particular about Afro-Cherokee families. She spends a segment on that, talking about the captivity and adoption practices, the mourning war rituals that are prevalent throughout the throughout North America east of the Mississippi in the early colonial period, and how there's a transition with the people that Elena was talking about. There's a transition from this sort of traditional mourning war captive taking, sort of ritual adoption that sort of blend with the practices of enslavement that the English bring to North America, and you kind of have a blending of these captivity traditions. But that's a good book that looks at that. There's another book by a guy named Brett Rushforth that looks at more northerly that tribes that are engaged in what scholars usually call the Beaver Wars, the fight over the fur trade. These mourning war rituals get blended with that warfare process where you get lots of captive taking exchange, and to sort of try to bring into those wars the French and the English start trying to get people to return slaves, which is really difficult when they get adopted and captive. And Brett Rushforth actually does scholarship on how lots of tribes in the north and east of Mississippi start raiding tribes in along Mississippi to get people who weren't involved, so that they take slaves from those communities. They don't get caught up in the same mourning war ritual cycle, and using those slaves to fulfill their sort of exchange that's being requested of them. So there's lots of ways in which indigenous patterns of captivity are kind of warped and twisted by various forms of colonialism and colonial slavery. I don't know if Elena wants to elaborate on that.
You said it far better than I.
Well, I do have a question. Oh, Fiona, why don't you go ahead? Because I can always claim the last word.
Okay. I was just wondering, both in terms of the historiography, where, and in terms of the conversations that's happening among descendants, where the questions of reparations fit.
Well, this is partly why I'm interested in how far into the present Elena's project is going to go.
Okay. To the modern day, like to, I don't know, whenever, like a year before it's published, I guess. Because there are so many discussions going on in Oklahoma about, who is indigenous, who should be a part of all of the great things that, like, the 5 tribes are doing in Oklahoma, within the rural parts of Oklahoma, which is much of Oklahoma. They are like the ones running the schools and like the great preschools that everyone wants to get into, and subsidizing the hospitals. They were giving out COVID-19 shots. That's like where so many rural white people got their first shot. And so the issue of whether, like, the land allotments that I mentioned in my talk, that are given from Native American land, but actually really kind of forced by the United States government, whether that's reparations is kind of something I have struggled with. In my book, I say I believe it is, because it is coming from a group of white men in the federal government who think of it that way, as a way to allow Black people to become kind of autonomous, independent, small farmers, which is kind of their idealistic world view. But today, when you have people who are still struggling to be accepted as Native, when you have people in the Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations who are like Black and Native and cannot either exercise all rights of citizenship or any, then I think you still have kind of another wave of reparations, because reparations is, yes, maybe something monetary or maybe land, but it's also an apology. It's also an acknowledgement. And Native nations themselves have not done that except for the Cherokee Nation, which has only recently done that after almost 20 years of lawsuits. And so you have, that set of reparations. You have, Native Americans and the Land Back movement at large, which, if you read Margaret Jacobs' most recent really amazing book, that's actually happening across the country. Like individuals and communities and cities are giving land back to Native people, Native communities, because they realize that they can make a difference on this kind of smaller level. And then of course you have the African American movements for reparations, which kind of runs into an issue when Black people are still thinking of their 40 acres, but that 40 acres was originally Native Americans' 40 acres. And I think that's where we have to spread information about like Native American history and trauma, and how we can kind of coexist and create a world in which both groups are getting what they feel they need to move forward. And that may not be land, it may be, I don't know, apologies from the US government, or I don't know. I know Kyle Mays is working on a book looking at this very kind of question, so I'm kind of waiting for him so I can then direct everyone to that answer because I don't have it yet.
And John Conyers, who's a congressman from Detroit, every year the Congress introduced a bill about reparations. It wasn't the call for reparations, it was just a bill, introduced a bill to study the idea of reparations, and he was shot down time after time after time. And all he was saying was, I'm not a bill saying we're demanding reparations, saying, let's just look at it. Congress studies everything. And the sort of anti-Black racism involved in rejection of time after time gets repeated. I think also the people in survivors of the Tulsa massacre were looking at reparations scale with that. And then another sort of reparations adjacent kind of question. Everybody's familiar with the land-grant colleges and universities that every state in the union has, right? Those universities are 100% entirely funded originally by the sale of Indian land, through Indian land scripts that are created as financial instruments and then sold or given to every different state. They gave them land scripts in proportion to their population, and they either sold those land scripts or invested in it, took possession of the land, and that became the basis for the endowment for every land-grant university in the United States. And the reason that there were those land scripts to give is that the treaty process that I mentioned was running around courts and forcing Native people to sign off treaties, as long as they put pennies on the dollar. Oftentimes those land cessions were in excess of the demand for the land. So huge chunks of the land that go to funding Cornell were from the treaties that I'm studying in my books in Wisconsin, northern Michigan, because there just wasn't a demand, even with the demand for logging like that. So that land that could have been in the sort of possession of indigenous people instead sits in the public domain, and they get snapped up sometimes by 30, 40 years later by timber companies when suddenly you have the infrastructure to pull timber out of northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan. You end up with people who end up being sort of land barons because they buy all that land and sitting there in public domain for pennies on the acre in the late 19th century, and then acquire huge tracts of land, or land that's given to railroads, or land that's given to states. So the land back movement is trying to get some of that stuff. The University of Michigan is looking at one of these robber barons who got this timber land that was acquired in the 1880s or 90s, but had been alienated from trees in the 1830s, and he sat in possession of that. It was a UM alumni, and they transferred it to Michigan, and so they're in possession of that land, and they're trying to figure out how they can give it back. So that stuff's all floating around out there. There's a lot of land that was taken and that was sometimes used, sometimes given away. Sometimes people just sat on it, but it was depriving indigenous people of the land, the compensation, of the wealth they would have had they been able to maintain possession of it.
Yeah, so I am going to take Chair's prerogative and just, I think in terms of our subtitle, we actually found a lot more convergences than I actually anticipated. I think Lynn, you nicely summed up that classic paradigm of African-American labor, Native American land. And you are obviously challenging that, as is Elena, from different directions. She's showing the importance of land to African-Americans in Indian territory, and the importance of slavery. I also thought both Michael and Manisha, you raised kind of other convergences that I hadn't really thought about much before. Michael pointing to sort of what happens in courts, Voting Rights Act. Manisha also with the historiography, that even though both groups have, in a sense, had a lot of attention paid to their history in the past few decades, this is actually still, there's this sort of white domination of what counts as a method, what counts as a source. I was wondering about divergences, maybe it's because I'm a glass half empty person, but particularly as with the issue of reparations, because reparations, the African American claim on the state can only be as individuals, whereas the American Indians, those who are members of tribes, they can have a claim on the state as a collective, as a group. They have group rights. And to me, that would be an important difference. And I thought, Michael, for sure you were going to mention Chippewa treaty rights, being Chippewa, in response to that question. But, where they can win a battle in court, the Chippewa tribes could win a major victory in court. A little of that. But as a group, a Chippewa individual couldn't. The tribe can. So I just wondered if you thought of if there was another divergence that, or other convergences that you see besides those that I noticed in your talk, just as a kind of wrap up for us to think about.
I guess the Ojibwe treaty rights have been born from the Northern Great Lakes. The people have recognized the trees, granted the right to hunt and fish, do different harvest resources on land that's not part of the that's not part of the tribal territory, out of season, in season, regardless of fish and game warning. And people started doing that in the 80s and 90s, met with a ferocious backlash, and took it to court and had those rights reaffirmed as the sovereign right of the tribes and sanctuaries of the United States. And they reclaimed lots of those resources, but also lots of territory. I guess what I was thinking about in terms of, I've been more lately thinking about just those rights, but I've been thinking more about the land loss and the rights that went with that, more than that's one step to reclaiming sovereignty, but also, I'm done with that part, I'm ready for the land back.
I actually wanted to kind of piggyback on the first question that was asked, because the question and your answer made me think of, I appreciate how there should be maybe a more generous interpretation of these people's racial identities. Maybe it's not just kind of playing Indian for expedient purposes, that they may actually be Native. And that made me think of today, how many African Americans have a tradition of Native American heritage in their families, real or not. And almost every time I give a talk, there's always a question from a Black person who kind of wants me to validate their family history. And often I'm kind of a wet blanket, because we like Black community as well as other people want to have this very idealistic view of Black and Native people as people who are both getting screwed over by colonization, and so we're going to work together and kind of fight the man. And of course there are multiple instances of that throughout history, but obviously the history I study is very much not that. And so I try to balance both of those things, but I'm just kind of wondering, how can I incorporate that more in my answer and kind of give more, I don't know, allow people to have their family narrative?
So I do think, Nancy, that if you want to emphasize contradictions, then the Reconstruction era is the time, because Native peoples are excluded from all those federal civil rights laws, the 14th Amendment, and the idea is that they are sovereign nations, right? And they're not really sovereign, right? And they have these relationships with the federal government, which really puts them under the plenary power of the government without any of those individual citizenship right protections sometimes. And so I found Phil Deloria's article really interesting for that reason, because he says, okay, it seems like a contradiction. It seems if Native people claim individual citizenship rights, they have to give up their national identity, right, and their belonging to a nation. But actually, what they're doing in this time, the late 19th century, is something quite interesting, is using these ideas to reinscribe political belonging and even claims to land, which is why the land back movement is so interesting, because I think it is probably a continuation of that. So what seemed like a contradiction to me in the beginning ended up as more of a convergence. And maybe we shouldn't even talk about it in those terms, because these things are so complex and nuanced in many ways. And the way people negotiated them, given the landscape, without accepting the sort of hegemonic ways of defining citizenship, or even the rights of people. People are constantly negotiating this. I think Michael's work, Elena's work, shows that really quite well. Your work shows that actually quite well. So I'll go, yeah, maybe there are more convergences.
Okay, so I think Manisha gets the last word. And we'll give a hand to our participants.